welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jenn, and I am joined by the author of a work of historical fiction that was so well researched, so vividly portrayed. I really felt like I was taken back to time to occupied Paris. So let's talk about this book. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Of course. So my name is Aurélie Thiele, and my book is Paris Understudy. And it's set in Paris during the occupation, during World War II. And it's about two opera singers in Paris. So one who is very famous, the other one who becomes their understudy. And they have to make choices about what to do to fulfill their passion for art, and at the same time navigating those very complicated circumstances in Paris.
It is so well, gosh, I said it before, but I'm going to say it again. It's just so beautifully portrayed. I felt like I learned so much about both the time period and about the world of opera and sort of how it functions and sort of what types of dynamics you find there. Could you talk a little bit about what led you to this project? Yeah, talk a little bit about your writing career and how you came to this book in particular.
I'm so glad you're telling me you found it well researched, because it took me 12 years to write this book. So I'm glad at least people don't come away with the impression that it's like a rush job. And so I found out about a famous French opera singer named Germaine Lubin, who sang for the Nazis and collaborated with the Nazis during the occupation. To some extent, she associated with the Nazis. She did not do active acts of collaboration, but she definitely associated with them. And when I found out about this real life character, I thought this would be an interesting character to put in a book. So that was 12 years ago. And it turned out this was not a very interesting character to put in a book, because at least in public, she never expressed any remorse about associating with the Nazis. She wanted to sing, and so, there were the Nazis in Paris, so she just hung out with them, which is obviously not an interesting character in a novel. But I thought, what about I split her in two? What about I have a very famous French opera singer on one hand, and that's Madeleine, and what about I also have another ambitious young woman who is just starting out late in the business and ends up collaborating with the Nazis and having an affair with a German officer, which Germaine Lubin is said to also have had. So I just split the key characteristics of Lubin into those two characters and made them kind of go at each other's throat in a little bit, in some way.
Wow, that is fascinating. Yeah, I thought it was so interesting to hear that sort of one person is made into two characters in this, because they do share a lot of qualities. They obviously have the same dreams, and they are very ambitious and willing to do a lot to reach those dreams. But there's a lot of differences that also sort of shape their interpersonal dynamic too. Like Madeleine is wealthy and she has a good reputation, she is established, and Yvonne is sort of up and coming and, a little bit less stable in the world. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about the world of opera actually, and what sort of research you did there and how that shapes their characters?
Sure. I discovered opera when I was a teenager, and my parents would bring me and my brother to the Brussels Opera, La Monnaie. So I've had decades of going to opera. I just love that they sing without microphones to those huge audiences. And there's something about the voice that really physically resonates with people. And it's been always so captivating world for me. So I don't sing though. It's a good thing I don't think you would not enjoy this experience. But I've always been impressed with the feelings that can rise in people. And I think it was the right performing art for that period too, because when you think about occupied Paris, the Nazis would not have gone to theater since they did not understand French. And there were not a lot of other art forms that they could have enjoyed, while opera has very famous German composers, including Richard Wagner, and Isolde is a key character that my protagonist, Yvonne, ends up singing a lot. So she ends up being a specialist of Wagnerian operas. And so I felt this was the right medium for a lot of Nazis at the time to mingle with the French. And this way we could really look at them and interacting with each other.
It is sort of fascinating to combine the drama of the opera and the competition between these two women who want to succeed and who see each other perhaps as threats, you know, to their success, with the high drama of a war that's going on, that's brewing around them. It's so interesting the way that just it feels like it works so well together, the opera and this like really tense time where tensions are building and becoming worse and worse. Could you talk a little bit about researching Paris at that time? You paint a very vivid portrait, I think, of not only the opera world and the world at large too, but also really capture the feeling of what it would have been like to live in occupied Paris, where you had to balance your survival with your morals in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I lived in Paris for 5 years when I was a college student, and I very much remember seeing all those plaques where they say, here fell soldier so-and-so at the liberation of Paris, August 25th, 1944. And to this day, I think any French person who reads a plaque like this is always feeling a lot of emotions. And I've been to the Palais Garnier, where the Paris Opera was at the time of the war. Now it's really used for the ballet company because the opera is at Bastille, but at the time it was at Palais Garnier. So I've been there, and I've been along the River Seine, where Yvonne ends up having an apartment. So there were a lot of things that I've seen personally that also were there at the time. And then for period details, I did a lot of research, mostly on the internet, and I cannot begin to tell you how impressed I am with any historical fiction writer who wrote before the internet was there. And I read also a lot of books about the time, about Bayreuth, where Madeleine and Yvonne go to that opera festival. And I also did some research about Paris, but there was so much that was through the internet. And pictures, I like pictures, I'm a very visual person. So I went through a lot of pictures to really capture the atmosphere of the time. And then I also looked at the website of the Paris Opera, because they have a section about the war. And sometimes I would also look a lot at photographs of even key characters and just imagine the setup. And again, it's all thanks to the internet. So it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, because you start thinking, I need to get this one detail right on page 114, line 12. Otherwise, there will be one person who knows it's not correct and will call me out on it, and everybody will know. So I'm an engineer in my day job. I'm an engineering professor, so I'm very detail oriented to begin with. And so I really took pains to double check and triple check all the little details I had in the book, which I guess is coming through now.
Nice. Yeah, that's very interesting. I really enjoyed the scene about the Beirut festival. The spectacle itself was really fascinating. I don't want to I can cut this if you don't want to reveal this, but Hitler is there and he is portrayed on page. And so learning about that and that scene, which is so tense, was just so interesting. One of the things I love about historical fiction is that it tells you not only about like the past, but about the present, So like when you were crafting that scene and fallout of a particular photograph that's taken, were you thinking about the present as well as the past? Because it feels like a very contemporary sort of culture reaction too, if that makes sense, with our current media climate.
Well, to be honest, I went to the Bayreuth Festival a couple of times with my parents, and that chapter was particularly meaningful for me because my mother passed away unexpectedly 2 years ago before she even knew the book was going to be published. But she was my biggest supporter. And talking about this festival after I've been into the festival house itself and listened to an opera there made me feel connected to my mother. And that was, the most important thing for me. I think in terms of connection with the times, I was particularly interested about that part of the book was how even in the present, people normalize certain behavior or go with the flow. And there are a lot of reactions at a high level that echo how people reacted and during the occupation. And a lot of people during the occupation were very, I like to think very good people. Of course, I'm a little biased because I'm French, but I think they did the best with the circumstances they were facing. Most of them. Like, we're not talking about the very bad people. But a lot of them afterwards felt a lot of shame, for instance, about the Veldiv roundup. And that's why until 1995, when the French president formally apologized for the roundup, which was led by the French police on German orders, but it was led by the French police, people did not want to even talk about it. So it really lasted 50 years of shame for this behavior. And so I like to think about that when I also think about current events. And, sometimes people feel, well, it's a lesser of two evils, whatever rationalization. And maybe some people will end up feeling shame for 50 years afterwards. So I did think a little bit about this connection, but I wanted especially to focus on the complexity of people's action. And both Madeleine and Yvonne come to an ethical breakthrough. So they end up having a character arc where they realize, in a way, there are way more important things than singing on stage, even if it's a big passion. So I did want them to have this character arc, and hopefully people also take away some lessons in how they want to live their life today out of reading the book.
Yeah, I really love historical fiction's ability to, make me feel empathy, I think, for people in the past, because it's really, really easy to judge people who lived way before you and who didn't have access to the information that you have when you are making your own judgments, And I think like historical fiction is very good at showing how complex these things are and how people are making the best choices they can, oftentimes, like under the circumstances. Yeah, I really felt for both characters, even though they both do things that, are not great all the time, So could you talk a little bit about crafting their character arcs and also how you balance their flaws with the things that make you root for them?
Yeah, so initially I started focusing on Yvonne as my main protagonist. And when I started writing Madeleine's character, she was just an obnoxious diva who thinks everybody is under her and is screaming at other people during rehearsal. And she was one note, let's admit it. And I knew from the start I wanted Yvonne to realize, after she ends up being dragged into an affair with a Nazi officer, how wrong she'd been. So I knew she would have this character arc of punishment and redemption. And we're not going to say how it's going to happen because people will have to read the book. But I was very clear on her arc. And after a while, I realized that Madeleine, being the antagonist of Yvonne, really should also have a character arc. And it was fun to discover little by little the sort of things she would end up doing. And specific elements of Madeleine's redemption really only were written in the very last draft of the book, where it's a little bit like carving stuff out of stone, and you take out the layers and you read it and you say, it's not quite there. And then suddenly, once you see the progression or the evolution she has in the book, you start thinking, she needs to do this. She's going to do this now, because that's Madeleine, and she's a strong person, and she's not going to just stay in her home crying her eyes out. She's going to do something. And so for me, that was almost fascinating to discover it little by little, by revision and rewriting and finding something about her I had not expected at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that happens for both characters. They have really interesting arcs, and I think I went through a lot with both of them, and like you feel respect and you feel admiration and also caution, and then sometimes you're like, oh no, girl, don't do that, you know. But it's so interesting. So I mentioned that Hitler appears on the page, and I'm always fascinated by portrayals of him because he's such a figure loaded with, he's been studied over and over again. He's been portrayed a million times, and he sort of is more of a caricature than he is like a real historical figure sometimes. So can you talk about writing somebody who is so fraught with meaning? How do you render them real on the page?
There's a friendship he had with Winifred Wagner, who is the organizer of the festival, and also Richard Wagner's daughter-in-law, was real. So I kept thinking about him in real life, going to that opera festival for real, because he really attended every summer. Where I had to be really careful is to make sure I was using exactly the right words when I describe Yvonne's reaction to seeing him, for instance, or Madeleine's reaction, because I could feel it in my body how she would be disgusted and appalled. But I wanted to make sure it would carry through on the page, because it's not the reader's job to be psychic and guess what you felt. You have to convey it on the page to make sure this comes through, because the page is the only communication instrument we writers have with our reader. So I had the scene blocked, in this, using the theater word, blocked from the start, but then I had to be very careful during the revision process to make sure I got all the feelings right. So definitely it was fraught with a certain sense of danger, because I did not want to mess that scene up, because there will be people who read the book who had family members murdered by Nazis. And so you want to really do a good job when you have to put someone like him in a book.
Yes. Yeah, that's really hits the point for me. I think it's very interesting too, like the scene really well conveys that interaction would take another kind of performance almost, because you'd be balancing all your inner emotions and all your reactions and then performing whatever you think will help you survive that moment, in the moment. So
Exactly. That was exactly it.
wow. Yeah, it is such a fascinating book. And I think it really takes you on not only like a historical journey into like a really fascinating time period, but you go on a very dramatic emotional journey with these two characters. And I emerge for them with a lot of mixed feelings, but also respect and just like thinking about them a long time after the book ended. So thank you so much for sharing them with me and for sharing this book with our listeners.
Thank you. I really appreciate the care you obviously put into reading the book, and thank you very much.
So
And I'm glad you like it.
Thank you. Are you working on anything else at the moment? I know you're a professor, so you're probably also busy with your research, but do you plan on writing more novels?
Yes, definitely. So the novel I hope to finish soon-ish, is about young school teacher in Madrid at the end of the Spanish Civil War. And she was on the Republican side along with her husband. And the Republicans are the ones who were for democracy and lost the war against General Franco. And she is thrown into the maelstrom of history after her husband gets arrested, and she has to decide what to do.
Wow. Well,
Historical fiction forever.
yes, love it. Glad to hear it. And I'm glad to hear more novels about women in history making very, very difficult decisions. I think that's very interesting.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, listeners, please check out the Paris Understudy. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for books. Okay, it is now time to close this chapter. Goodbye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.